Daniel Harris had only been working at the office for about 3 months, and while the job itself was normal, the environment always felt slightly off in a way he couldn't fully explain. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing you could point to directly, but there was always this strange tension in the air, especially during late hours when most employees had already gone home. And Daniel often found himself staying late to finish work because he wanted to impress his manager and secure his position. But the night everything changed started like any other. Around 8:45 p.m., the office was nearly empty. Most of the lights were turned off except for the section where Daniel was working. The hum of computers and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights were the only sounds breaking the silence. Daniel leaned back in his chair, stretching slightly as he glanced around the empty office. Rows of desks, dark monitors, chairs pushed in neatly, everything still, everything quiet. He checked the time and sighed, knowing he still had at least an hour of work left. And just as he turned back to his screen, he noticed something that made him pause. At the far end of the office, near the cubicles that were supposed to be empty, he saw a light on, a single desk lamp glowing faintly in the darkness. Daniel frowned, trying to remember if anyone else had stayed late, but he couldn't think of anyone. Most of his co-workers had left hours ago. He hesitated for a moment, then stood up slowly, curiosity pulling him toward the light. As he walked across the office, his footsteps echoed softly in the quiet space. The closer he got, the more uneasy he felt, and when he finally reached the desk, he saw someone sitting there, facing away from him, their posture slightly hunched, completely still. Daniel stopped a few feet away, his heart beating a little faster. "Hey," he called out softly, expecting the person to respond. But they didn't move, didn't react at all. Daniel stepped closer. "I thought everyone left," he said, trying to sound casual, but still no response. The figure remained completely still, and that's when Daniel noticed something strange. The computer screen in front of the person was off, completely black, and yet the person was just sitting there, staring at it, unmoving. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice quieter now. And then slowly, the person began to move, their head turning just slightly, but not enough to reveal their face. And in a low, flat voice, they replied, "I'm still working." Daniel frowned. The voice sounded off, unnatural, like it lacked emotion, like it didn't belong in a normal conversation. "You should probably head out soon," Daniel said, trying to brush off the feeling. But the person didn't respond again, just remained sitting there, staring at the blank screen. Daniel stood there for a moment, unsure what to do, and then slowly backed away, returning to his desk, trying to focus on his work, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. About 20 minutes passed, and Daniel found himself glancing toward the other side of the office repeatedly. The light was still on, the figure still sitting there, completely unmoving, and then suddenly the lights above Daniel flickered briefly, causing him to jump slightly. He looked up, then back toward the other desk, and that's when his stomach dropped. The light at the far desk was now off, completely dark, and the figure was gone. Daniel stood up quickly, his heart starting to race. He looked around the office, scanning every corner, but there was no one there, no movement, no sound, just empty desks and darkness. Daniel swallowed hard, telling himself the person must have left quietly. Maybe he didn't notice, maybe he was just overthinking it. He sat back down, trying to calm himself. But then he heard something that made his blood run cold. A soft sound coming from directly behind him, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. He didn't want to turn around, every instinct telling him not to, but slowly he did, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Sitting at the desk, directly behind him was the same person, facing away from him, completely still. Exactly as before, Daniel's heart began pounding violently. "How did you," he started to say, but his voice caught in his throat. The person didn't respond, didn't move, just sat there, staring at another blank screen. Daniel stood up slowly, backing away, his fear growing with every second. And then suddenly, the office lights flickered again, plunging everything into darkness for just a moment. And when the lights came back on, the person was gone again. Daniel felt panic rising, his mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. And then he heard it, footsteps coming from somewhere deeper in the office, slow and deliberate. Daniel turned toward the sound, his body trembling, and saw the figure walking between the rows of desks, moving in an unnatural way. Its steps uneven, almost jerky. Daniel took a step back, his breath coming faster now, and then the figure stopped, slowly turning toward him, its face still hidden in shadow, and in that same flat voice, it spoke again. "You're still here." Daniel didn't respond, his fear overwhelming him, and then suddenly, every computer in the office turned on at once, their screens lighting up with the same image, a clock-in system displaying employee records. Daniel's eyes darted across the screens, and then he saw something that made his blood run cold. The name of the coworker he had just seen, marked as clocked in, but the date next to it was from 3 years ago, and beneath it a note that read, "Deceased." Daniel felt his legs weaken, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing, and then slowly, the figure began to walk toward him, its movements becoming more distorted, its shape flickering under the harsh office lights. Daniel turned and ran, his heart pounding, heading straight for the exit, but as he reached the door and tried to open it, it wouldn't move. The handle stuck. Daniel pulled harder, panic taking over. And then behind him, he heard the voice again, closer now, right behind him. "You haven't clocked out." Daniel froze, his hand still on the door, and slowly turned his head, and standing just inches away from him was the figure, its face finally visible, pale and empty, its eyes dark and hollow. And in that moment, Daniel realized something that made his blood run cold. The face wasn't just a stranger's, it looked exactly like him. And just before everything went dark, he heard the sound of a clock-in machine beeping softly, as if marking the start of shift that would never end. Mark Ellison never liked the night shift, but he needed the extra money. So when his manager offered him a temporary overnight position at the office for a few weeks, he accepted without thinking too much about it. The job itself wasn't difficult, just monitoring systems, answering occasional emails, and making sure everything stayed running until the morning staff arrived. But what made the job unsettling wasn't the work. It was the silence, the emptiness of the building after midnight, when the busy office turned into a quiet, lifeless space filled only with dim lights and long shadows. And the night everything changed started like any other. Mark arrived around 11:45 p.m., grabbed his coffee, and sat down at his desk. The office mostly dark except for a few overhead lights and the glow of computer screens. He logged into the system, checked a few reports, everything normal, nothing unusual. But around 1:10 a.m., something small happened that he didn't pay much attention to at first. His computer screen flickered briefly, the display glitching for just a second before returning to normal. Mark frowned slightly but ignored it, assuming it was just a system lag. But then it happened again, this time lasting longer, the screen going black for a moment before coming back on. And when it did, something was different. There was a new window open on his desktop, one he didn't recognize. It looked like a staff monitoring system, showing a list of employees currently in the building. Mark leaned closer, confused because he was supposed to be the only one there, but the system showed 2 names, his own, and another one listed simply as night staff replacement. Mark frowned, trying to remember if someone else was scheduled to come in, but no one had told him anything. He looked around the office, the rows of desks empty, chairs neatly pushed in, everything still. Mark shook his head and closed the window, telling himself it was probably a system error. But a few minutes later, he heard something that made him pause, a faint sound coming from the hallway, like footsteps, slow and steady. Mark sat still, listening carefully. The sound grew slightly louder, echoing softly in the empty building. Mark stood up slowly, his heart beating a little faster, and walked toward the hallway, the lights above flickering slightly as he moved. When he reached the corner and looked down the hall, he saw nothing, just a long stretch of dim light and closed office doors completely empty. The footsteps had stopped, replaced by silence. Mark let out a breath and turned back toward his desk, tried to ignore the feeling creeping up his spine, but as he sat down, his computer screen flickered again, and the same window reopened on its own. The employee list still showing 2 names, but this time, the second name had changed slightly. It now read night staff replacement, active. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. He stared at the screen, unsure of what to do. And then suddenly, the office lights dimmed for a moment, the hum of electricity growing louder. And from somewhere in the building, he heard a door slam shut, the sound echoing through the empty halls. Mark jumped to his feet, his fear starting to build, and then his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out quickly, hoping it was someone from work, but there was no message, no notification, just the screen lighting up for no reason. And then slowly, text began to appear on its own, one word at a time. "You're not scheduled tonight." Mark stared at the screen in disbelief, his hands shaking slightly, and then the message disappeared, leaving his phone blank again. Mark's breathing became uneven, his mind racing, trying to make sense of everything. And then he heard it again, the footsteps, this time closer, coming from just outside the office area. Mark turned toward the sound, his body tense. And in the dim light of the hallway, he saw something move. A figure walking slowly toward him, its shape barely visible, its movements unnatural. Mark took a step back, his heart pounding. "Hello," he called out, his voice shaky, but the figure didn't respond. It just kept walking, its steps slow and deliberate. Mark felt panic rising. He turned and rushed toward the exit door, but as he reached it and grabbed the handle, it wouldn't open. The lock stuck just like before. Mark pulled harder, his fear growing, and then behind him, the footsteps stopped. Mark froze, his hand still on the door, and slowly turned around. The figure was now standing at the edge of the office, just a few feet away, its face still hidden in shadow. And then it spoke, in a voice that sounded almost human but slightly distorted. "You weren't supposed to come in." Mark's breath caught in his throat. He backed away slowly, his body trembling. And then suddenly, every computer screen in the office turned on at once, displaying the same thing, a security camera. Feed of the building, showing multiple angles, multiple rooms, and in each feed, Mark saw himself, standing in different parts of the office. Even though he hadn't moved, each version of him completely still, staring directly at the camera. Mark felt his mind breaking, unable to understand what was happening. And then the figure took a step closer, its presence growing stronger, heavier, and then it spoke again. "I replaced you." Mark shook his head, panic overwhelming him. He turned and ran down the hallway, his footsteps echoing loudly, his breath coming fast. He didn't know where he was going, just trying to get away. But as he turned a corner, he saw something that made him stop. At the end of the hall was another version of himself, standing still, blocking the way. Mark stumbled backward, his fear at its peak, and then he heard footsteps behind him again. Turning slowly, he saw the figure approaching, and now, under the flickering lights, its face became visible, pale, empty, with dark, hollow eyes, and it looked exactly like him. Mark felt his legs give out, his body freezing in place, and then the lights went out completely, plunging everything into darkness, the silence overwhelming. And in that darkness, he heard the sound of typing, rapid and uneven, as if someone was working on a keyboard. And then his phone lit up again in his hand, displaying a single message, "Shift complete." And when the morning staff arrived hours later, they found the office exactly as it should be, quiet, empty, nothing out of place except for one thing. On the employee system, there was only one name listed under night shift, night staff replacement, active, and Mark Ellison's name was nowhere to be found. Ethan Cole had always thought that working in an office was one of the safest jobs you could have. Nothing dangerous, nothing unpredictable, just routine work, familiar faces, and a structured environment. But the longer he worked there, the more he began to notice small things that didn't quite feel right, things that most people ignored, especially when it came to the company's internal chat system. A simple messaging tool used by employees to communicate during work hours, something normal and harmless, until the night he stayed late and received messages from someone who shouldn't have been there at all. It started around 9:15 p.m. when Ethan was finishing up a report. Most of his coworkers had already left, the office quiet except for the occasional sound of typing and the faint hum of computers. The lights were dimmed in most sections, leaving only a few areas illuminated. Ethan leaned back in his chair, stretching slightly as he checked the time. He still had about 30 minutes of work left, and just as he turned back to his screen, a notification popped up on his computer, a message from the company chat system. Ethan frowned slightly, because it was unusual to receive messages that late, especially when most people had already gone home. He opened the chat window and saw the message. It was from a user named Support Desk, which wasn't strange at first, but the message itself was, it simply read, "Are you still working?" Ethan hesitated for a moment before replying. "Yeah, just finishing up." A few seconds passed, and then another message appeared. "You should leave." Ethan frowned, confused by the response. "Why?" He typed back, but there was no reply. The chat window remained silent. Ethan shrugged it off, assuming it was some kind of automated message or maybe a mistake. He went back to his work, trying to ignore it. But a few minutes later, another message appeared, this time from the same user. "He is still there." Ethan's fingers froze over the keyboard, his heart beating slightly faster. "Who?" he typed, his unease growing. And after a short pause, the reply came, "The one who stayed." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced around the office, the rows of desks empty, the silence heavy. "What are you talking about?" He typed quickly, but this time there was no response. The chat window remained still. Ethan leaned back, trying to calm himself, telling himself it was probably just someone messing with him, maybe a coworker playing a joke, but something about the messages felt wrong. The way they were written, the timing, it didn't feel like a joke. It felt serious, too serious. Ethan shook his head and tried to focus on his work again, but then he heard something that made him stop, a faint sound coming from somewhere behind him, like a chair moving slowly across the floor. Ethan turned his head slightly, his body tense. But the office behind him looked empty, nothing out of place, no movement. Ethan swallowed hard and turned back to his screen, but then his computer flickered briefly, the screen glitching for a second. And when it came back, the chat window was open again, even though he hadn't touched it, and a new message appeared, "Don't turn around." Ethan's breath caught in his throat, his hands going still, his heart starting to pound. He stared at the screen, his mind racing, and then slowly, another message appeared. "He is right behind you." Ethan felt his entire body go cold, every instinct telling him not to move, not to look, but the urge to turn around was overwhelming. His breathing became shallow, his hands trembling, and then he heard it again, the sound behind him, closer this time, like something shifting its weight. Ethan closed his eyes for a second, trying to steady himself, and then suddenly the lights above him flickered, casting brief flashes of darkness across the office. And in that moment, he couldn't resist anymore. He turned around quickly, his heart pounding, but there was nothing there, the office completely empty, just rows of desks and shadows. Ethan let out a shaky breath, his fear mixing with confusion, and then his computer made a soft notification sound again. Ethan turned back slowly, his movements cautious, and looked at the screen, the chat window now filled with multiple messages, all from the same user, repeating over and over. "You looked, you looked, you looked." Ethan felt panic rising, his mind struggling to keep up, and then suddenly all the lights in the office went out, plunging everything into complete darkness. The only light now coming from his computer screen, casting a faint glow around him. Ethan stood up slowly, his body shaking, and then he heard something that made his blood run cold. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving somewhere in the darkness. Ethan's breathing became rapid, his heart pounding in his ears, and then the computer screen flickered again, switching from the chat window to a live security camera feed, showing the office from above. Ethan stared at it, his eyes wide, and what he saw made his entire body freeze. Standing directly behind him was a figure tall and still, its face hidden in shadow, its presence unmistakable. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He didn't move, didn't even breathe, and then slowly on the screen, the figure began to lean closer, its head tilting slightly, as if studying him. Ethan felt tears forming in his eyes, his fear overwhelming him. And then the chat window popped back up on the screen, a new message appearing. "He sees you now." Ethan's legs felt weak, his mind breaking under the pressure. And then suddenly, the office lights came back on, flooding the room with brightness. Ethan spun around quickly, but the figure was gone, completely gone, the office empty again. Ethan stood there, breathing heavily, his body trembling. And then his phone vibrated in his pocket. Ethan pulled it out slowly, his hands shaking, and when he looked at the screen, he saw something that made his blood run cold, a message from the same chat system. But this time on his phone, Check the system. Ethan hesitated but slowly turned back to his computer, his movements stiff, and looked at the screen, the employee database now open, showing a list of current and former employees. Ethan scrolled through it slowly, his heart pounding, and then he saw a name that made him stop, a former employee listed as deceased, the date from 2 years ago, and next to it a note that read, "Last seen working late." Ethan felt his breath catch in his throat, and then the screen changed again, switching to another camera feed, this time showing the office entrance. And standing just outside the door was the same figure, completely still, as if waiting. Ethan backed away slowly, his fear overwhelming him. And then the chat message appeared one last time. "You're staying late too." And just before the screen went black, Ethan realized something that made his blood run cold. The figure outside wasn't trying to get in, it was waiting for him to leave and take his place.